y'all, it's me, Chrissy, back again with the last section of my 4-part video series on canning basics. In this video, I will go over some common and less common questions that you might have about water bath and pressure canning. First, let me just introduce myself. You might have heard this a few times if you've been following along, but I'm Chrissy, the owner of Moon and Hair Collective and Urban Farm here in Oregon. I am an urban agriculture and homesteading educator, a curriculum developer, and a community herbalist. I grew up on a vegetable farm where I learned how to can and preserve food and eat seasonally, along with sewing and some other DIY skills. I ran away from the farming lifestyle as soon as I possibly could, but after a bunch of years, I felt the pull back to growing my own food and traditional homemaking. I now use permaculture and regenerative agriculture techniques on my urban homestead, where I also teach about urban farming, food preservation, cooking on a budget, seasonal living, and other homesteading skills as a medium to introduce people to food systems and sustainability issues. I'm really interested in the science and history behind the methods that we use to preserve food, so I'm able to understand the safety and the reliability of the process. And then I know which rules I can bend or even break. Okay, make sure you subscribe to my newsletter at the link in the description below so you'll get notified when I put out videos with more valuable homesteading and homemaking content. Okay, let's get to the questions. I've tried to organize these in order of the canning process. We'll see if I succeeded. If you have a question that I didn't answer here in this video, then please send me an email and I will try to answer it for you. Okay, the first question is, can fruit be canned without sugar? And the answer is yes. If the fruit is high enough acid, it can be water bath canned without any sugar. Talking about fruits like peaches and pear halves. However, I have found that a light sugar syrup is needed to keep the texture and the flavor of the fruit. It's like the flavor just dissipates into the liquid if you don't have any sugar. The exception to this, in my experience, is applesauce and pear sauce. They have an amazing amount of flavor and are high acid enough that they don't need any sugar at all. So I actually never can them with sugar. The next question is, do jars need to be sterilized before canning? And no, you actually don't have to do that anymore. They do need to be clean, of course, but they will be sterilized in the water bath or the pressure canner as long as the jars are in there for at least 5 minutes. So what determines how long a food is in the water bath or the pressure canner for? That is the density, the porosity, and the acidity of the food. In the case of acidity, sometimes the food is so acidic and heated through long enough that no microorganisms can grow in it. The canning process is actually just for sanitizing the jar. This is the case for jams mostly. That's why they're just water bath for 5 or maybe 10 minutes. But some foods like dry beans or meat are very dense and low acid, so they are pressure canned for a very long time to make sure that the proper temperature is reached all the way to the center of the jar. And then some foods cannot be canned at all. Pumpkin puree and mashed potatoes are low acid and so dense that they can't be heated all the way to the center. Pumpkin, winter squash, and potatoes are best canned in cubes, which you can then mash or puree when you open them. The next question is, do we really need to leave a certain amount of headspace in the jar? And the answer is yes. Leaving a specified amount of headspace in the jar is important to make sure that a vacuum seal is created. We leave headspace because food expands when it's heated, so we want to make sure there's enough space for that without the jars overfilling. If there's too little headspace, the food may expand and bubble out when the air is being forced out from under the lid during processing. The bubbling food then can leave a deposit on the rim of the jar or the seal of the lid and prevent the jar from sealing properly. If too much headspace is allowed, the food at the top is likely to discolor and the jar may not seal because the air won't be fully pushed out. The amount that food expands has to do with the air content of the food. For example, jams and jellies are already very hot and fully cooked when they're put in the jar, so they only need 1/4 of an inch because all the oxygen has gone out of the food. Whereas low acid and cold packed foods need 1 to 1.5 inches of headspace. So speaking of which, what's the difference between cold packed and hot packed? This is just how the food is going into the jar. If it's hot, it means that it's hot packed, or if it's cold packed. When you're hot packing the jars will heat up so you can put them right into the hot canner. But if you're cold packing and also not pouring a hot brine over the food, like in the case of dried beans or meat, you'll want to make sure that the water in the canner is no hotter than lukewarm so that none of your jars will break. You may have heard the term fingertip tight when recipes tell you how to put the lid on. Fingertip tight is how tight they say to screw on the band. But personally, I don't actually understand how this is a descriptive term. Basically, just screw the ring on until it just meets some resistance. Don't overthink it too much. Do you ever break jars when canning? This does happen sometimes, and it's always such a bummer because you lose the jar and also the food that you've worked so hard to process. In my experience, it's almost always an old jar, but occasionally it happens because the contents and the jar just weren't heated beforehand. Cold glass going into a boiling water bath is not a great situation. You can't really do much about old jars except just not use them if you choose. But do always inspect jars for hairline cracks. With the cold jar problem, make sure to always make sure your jars are heated up before putting them in the water bath. If you're putting hot liquids into the jar, like in the case of jams or a brine, just let the jar sit for a minute before putting it into the canner. But you can also heat up your jars in the dishwasher beforehand, which has the double purpose of making sure that they're nice and clean. And what do you do when it does happen? If you hear the jar pop in the middle of canning, don't do anything. Just wait until the whole process is done. There's no sense in starting the rest of the jars all over. When it's all done, remove the rest of the jars to a towel, just like usual. Now, carefully remove the broken jar and the contents and discard. Usually, the bottom has just popped off the jar, so it's fairly easy to remove. Still, you probably want to dump the canner out over a sieve or a strainer to make sure to catch everything. Wash out the pot and use fresh water for any more canning that you're going to do. So what do you do if a jar doesn't seal? I actually just had this happen because I didn't get the rings on the threads of the jar properly. It was a bummer because it was pickles and they really need a month to brine before they're ready and tasty. If the jar that didn't seal had a food like a sauce, even applesauce, ketchup, barbecue sauce, tomato sauce, a broth, or a jam or jelly, I will run it through the canner again. With these foods, it won't really change their texture. However, if it's something that was raw packed, like pickles or fruit, meat or beans, putting them through the canner may just turn them to mush. So it's better to just refrigerate them and use them within about a week or so. Basically, anything that you want the texture to last as long as possible, those I would not reprocess. What are some reasons for jars not sealing? Sometimes, despite our best efforts, a jar doesn't seal. Like I mentioned a minute ago, this just happened to me when I canned pickles. I didn't pay attention when I put the ring on and the threads didn't match up. It can also happen if the rubber on the lid doesn't seal to the jar. This rubber ring here is how the lid seals to the jar. It needs to be softened before placing on the jar. Now, it used to be recommended that we boil the lids, but these days they don't require it. I still soak my lids in a little warm water to make sure that the rubber gets soft to make a seal. Occasionally, the rim of a jar can get a nick in it, which will cause it to not seal. So before filling the jars, or at least when you're wiping down the rims, make sure to check for any nicks and cracks. Another reason jars might not seal is too much headspace. I talked about headspace a little earlier. If there is too much headspace, the jar may not seal. Just because sometimes they do seal doesn't mean it always will, so it's best to follow guidelines about headspace. And then there's siphoning. If you didn't leave enough headspace, sometimes you can get siphoning, meaning that the liquid was sucked out of the jar. This can cause there to be too much headspace, which is a reason that jars may not seal. But also, if the liquid is chunky or oily, it can get on the rim of the jar while siphoning and not let it seal. Finally, there's also faulty lids. There are lids that are better quality than others, and people definitely have their preferences. So just be careful to check reviews when buying lids, or stick with the ones that you know for sure will work. Do you keep the rings on the jars while they are in storage? The answer is no. The rings are not meant to be left on the jars while they're in storage. The reason for that is that often if they do end up having microorganisms growing inside, there may be gas buildup and the lid might unseal. And this is a really good way to know if the product has gone bad. If you're giving your canned goods as gifts, however, you may want to include the ring in case the recipient doesn't have rings of their own for once it's opened. So how do you know if a jar has gone bad? Well, if you follow the latest canning guidelines closely, you shouldn't have to worry much about the quality or the safety of your home canned food. But just like with store-bought food, it's always smart to check before using it. When you pull a jar off the shelf, make sure the seal is still intact and that nothing looks off. If the jar isn't sealed, that means the food has spoiled. Don't use food from jars that are no longer sealed. Spoilage can cause gases that can break the seal or make the lid puff up. Also, if the lid comes off easily without needing to break the seal, don't eat the food. Other signs of spoilage include mold, bubbling, cloudy liquid, spurting when opened, leaks, fermenting, or a slimy texture or bad smells. Also, if you know that low-acid foods were canned improperly, like using a water bath instead of a pressure canner, don't eat them. If you think the food is spoiled, throw it away without tasting it and make sure that people and animals can't get to it. How long does canned food keep? Most official canning sites will tell you that canned foods will stay good for about a year or 18 months. I've had canned foods that last a lot longer than that. If the seal is still good, then the food is safe, so it's really just a question of whether the food inside is still palatable. It will get mushier and may lose its flavor the longer that it's stored. But ideally, you're canning enough for 1 year and replacing it at the next year. So hopefully it's not a big deal and you're moving through the preserved foods over the course of a year. Okay, I think that's about it. I think there are probably a lot more questions that could be answered, so please email me if you have any more, and I'll answer them and post it on the website as well. Thanks for joining me on this adventure to learn all about canning. What a great way to preserve all the delicious food from your garden or the farmer's market or wherever you get a great deal on bulk food. Don't forget to subscribe to my newsletter down below in the description so you'll get access to all the freshest content. I'll see you all later.